Samuel Duarte had spent 30 grueling years on the police force, most of them patrolling some of the toughest streets in Atlanta. He had seen things that no man should ever have to witness: broken families, blood in the gutters, betrayal from fellow officers who wore the same badge but served a different justice. When retirement came, it wasn't with cheers or a party, it was with silence and a disability check. A bullet to the hip had ended his career, but the mental wounds cut far deeper. All he wanted now was peace, and he believed he had finally found it. He used his savings and pension to buy a beautiful house in a gated, mostly white community on the edge of town. The real estate agent looked surprised when Samuel signed the contract, as if men like him weren't supposed to live in places like that. But Samuel didn't care. The house was his. And in the backyard, glistening in the Georgia sun, was a wide, tranquil pool, a personal paradise after decades of chaos. For the first time in years, Samuel woke up without the weight of a bulletproof vest or the taste of gunpowder in his throat. He spent mornings sipping coffee by the pool, listening to jazz, letting the breeze remind him that life could still offer something soft. He planted azaleas along the fence, repainted the deck, and even started sketching again, a hobby he'd abandoned long ago. This was his sanctuary, built from scars and sacrifice. But peace is a fragile thing, especially when it offends the quiet power of those who feel entitled to control it. Samuel had lived his whole life under a system that demanded he stay silent, even when wronged. But here, in his own home, behind his own walls, he believed he was finally free. He didn't yet know that his freedom, his very presence, was about to awaken an old, ugly enemy wearing a new, smiling face. The house was everything Samuel had ever wanted, even if he hadn't dared to dream it during his years on the force. It had clean white walls, tall windows that welcomed the sunlight, and hardwood floors that echoed softly under his steps. But more than the architecture, it was the silence he valued most. No sirens, no radios crackling with distress calls. Just birds, wind, and his own breath finally steady. He would often stand at the edge of his pool, gazing at the water, amazed that after all the years of struggle, this peace belonged to him. He had no family of his own. No children, no spouse. His brothers in uniform had once filled that role, but those bonds had eroded, some from time, others from betrayal. This house, this piece of earth, was the first thing he'd ever claimed solely for himself. He treated it with the same discipline he had given the badge, every blade of grass trimmed, every window spotless, every corner kept with pride. It was more than property, it was proof that he had survived and maybe, just maybe, won. The neighborhood, however, didn't quite know what to make of him. At first, the residents offered tight smiles and shallow greetings. The HOA president, a wiry man named Richard Evans, handed him a welcome packet with rules about fences, trash bins, and noise levels. Nothing personal, of course, just policy. Samuel accepted it with a nod, though he could feel the unspoken tension beneath the politeness. His skin had always walked into rooms before his name ever did. Still, Samuel gave no one reason to complain. He stayed respectful, quiet, and self-sufficient. But deep down, he knew how fragile this arrangement was. The dream house stood on shaky ground, too clean, too calm, too perfect. And in neighborhoods like this, perfection often came with conditions. He hadn't yet met Karen Montclair. But the moment she stepped onto his property, the dream would begin to fracture. Karen Montclair lived 2 houses down, though her presence was felt long before Samuel ever saw her face. Whispers among neighbors mentioned her often, how she ran the HOA in all but name, how she had a way of handling newcomers who didn't understand the neighborhood's character. Her lawn was perfectly trimmed, her mailbox painted monthly, and her dog, a spoiled terrier named Jasper, barked like a siren every time Samuel walked past her driveway. The first time he met her, she didn't introduce herself. She stood by her gate, arms crossed, sunglasses shielding her eyes. Samuel had waved, as he always did, polite and calm. Karen stared at him for a few seconds too long, then turned away without a word. No hello. No welcome. Just the kind of silence that screamed louder than confrontation. It wasn't the first time Samuel had been looked at like that, but in his own neighborhood, on his own street, it cut deeper than usual. Over the next few weeks, her glances became routine. When Samuel was in the backyard cleaning the pool, she would pass by slowly, pretending to check her phone. When he watered the plants, she would pause just long enough to look uncomfortable, as if the sight of him tending beauty disrupted her sense of order. He noticed the pattern, the passive surveillance, and the thinly veiled contempt. But Samuel had lived long enough to know how this game was played, subtle, cold, and soaked in plausible deniability. Then came the moment he couldn't ignore. He caught her taking photos over his backyard fence. When he stepped outside to confront her, she smiled like it was nothing. Just documenting things for the HOA, she said. You know, in case something goes out of regulation. That's when Samuel realized she didn't just distrust him, she intended to remove him. It happened on a Saturday afternoon just after lunch. Samuel had gone inside to take a call from an old partner, leaving the back gate unlocked for a landscaper scheduled to arrive later. When he returned to the yard, what he saw stopped him cold. Karen Montclair, stretched out on a pool lounger like she owned the place, sunglasses on, a tall glass of iced tea in hand, and Jasper curled up at her feet. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. She didn't flinch when he stepped out onto the deck. Instead, she adjusted her hat and gestured toward the water. Beautiful pool, she said casually, as if this were some sort of country club visit. My AC went out and I figured I'd cool off here. It's just next door. Hope you don't mind. Her voice was drenched in entitlement, the kind of tone that dared him to say something and risk becoming the villain in her version of the story. Samuel kept calm. Years of policing had taught him to measure his words like landmines. This is private property, ma'am. I'd appreciate it if you left. Karen chuckled. No need to be so formal, officer. I'm sure the HOA wouldn't mind neighbors sharing resources during a heat wave. She rose slowly as if he had inconvenienced her. Just don't make this a thing, okay? Her smile was syrupy, her eyes sharp. She stepped out the gate without another word, as if she were doing him a favor. He stood there for several minutes after she left, staring at the chair she'd occupied, the condensation from her glass still pooling on its surface. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a message. Karen had crossed a line not because she didn't see it, but because she didn't believe Samuel had the right to draw one. 3 days after the uninvited visit, Samuel received a letter in his mailbox, official HOA stationery printed with the usual passive-aggressive tone. It cited a neighbor complaint regarding inappropriate use of outdoor amenities and suggested that Samuel review the neighborhood's shared space regulations. The implication was laughable. His pool was not shared. It was within his fenced backyard, legally his property. But what struck him most wasn't the letter, it was the timing. Karen had turned trespassing into accusation, and she'd done it with paperwork. That evening, he took a walk around the block just to feel the air and maybe clear his mind. As he passed Karen's house, she stepped onto her porch with Jasper at her heels. She didn't say hello. Instead, she called out loud enough for her voice to carry to other yards. You know, a lot of us are wondering if you really own that place. No offense, of course, but it seems a bit above your pay grade. The words hit him harder than expected, not because they surprised him, but because they confirmed everything he'd sensed since moving in. He stopped walking and turned to face her. I earned that house, he said, voice calm but steady. Every brick of it. Karen tilted her head, unconvinced. Sure, she replied. But around here, people don't just show up with a badge and think they can rewrite the rules. Samuel walked away before he said something he'd regret. But inside, something shifted. The line had been crossed again, only now it was public. She wasn't just challenging his presence, she was declaring war. The battle wouldn't be fought with fists or shouting matches, but with lies, letters, and neighborhood gossip. And Samuel knew, from a lifetime of quiet battles, that silence was no longer an option. The next HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a spotless room filled with folding chairs, lemon water, and whispered politics. Samuel had never attended one before, preferring to keep to himself. But after Karen's accusation and the suspicious letter, he knew he had to see the inner workings for himself. He walked in dressed sharp, buttoned shirt, slacks, the posture of a man who had once commanded a precinct. He noticed the glances. Curious. Cautious. Some surprised he was even there. Karen sat near the front, flanked by a few longtime residents who seemed glued to her every word. Richard Evans, the HOA president, welcomed everyone and began reading the agenda. When the topic of unauthorized pool access came up, Karen's hand shot into the air. I'd just like to reiterate that we must ensure consistency in how amenities are used. There have been irregularities, she said, without looking directly at Samuel. But everyone knew. The dart had been thrown. Samuel waited until the floor opened for comments. Then he stood, his voice calm and clipped, the way it used to be when briefing officers before a dangerous raid. If there's concern about property usage, I suggest we begin with trespassing laws. Because someone entered my yard without permission and I have security footage to prove it. The room fell into silence. Karen's smile froze. A few eyes darted between the two of them, tension thickening like fog. Richard cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable. Let's not get into personal disputes tonight. Samuel didn't sit down. This isn't personal. It's about the law. And respect. Both of which I intend to protect, with or without this board's help. The message was clear. He wasn't backing down. And for the first time since arriving, Samuel felt the balance shift ever so slightly because while Karen held sway with whispers, he was bringing receipts. The morning after the HOA meeting, Samuel found a small envelope tucked under his front door mat. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on delicate ivory paper. Let's not let things get out of hand. Maybe we should talk. It was meant to look civil, maybe even conciliatory, but Samuel could feel the edge beneath the script. Karen wasn't offering peace, she was offering control and assuming he'd bite. Still, Samuel believed in giving people the chance to correct themselves. He invited her over that afternoon, sitting out by the pool, 2 glasses of iced tea waiting. She arrived in a summer dress, bright lipstick and tight smiles like a politician at a press event. I admire your dedication to rules, she began, easing into the lounge chair. But in communities like ours, there's an understanding. We keep things quiet. Friendly. Unofficial. Samuel folded his hands, studying her. Unofficial doesn't override ownership. You entered my yard, used my pool, without consent. That's trespassing, Karen. Not a misunderstanding. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You really want to bring the police into this? She asked. I thought you, of all people, would understand how fragile things can be for someone like you in a place like this. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning wrapped in civility, sharpened by arrogance. That was the moment he realized peace was not her goal. Her kind of peace meant submission. Silence. The kind that had followed him his entire life. But this time was different. This was his property. His name on the deed. And he wouldn't be bullied into erasing himself just to make someone else more comfortable. The meeting ended with a handshake, cold and meaningless. Samuel returned to the house knowing one thing with clarity: Karen hadn't come to make peace. She'd come to measure how far she could go. It was dusk when it happened again. The sky was painted in burnt orange and fading blue, and Samuel had just stepped into the kitchen to finish preparing dinner. He heard the faint splash before he saw it. At first, he froze, hoping it was a raccoon, maybe a branch falling into the water. But when he stepped outside and looked toward the pool, there she was. Karen. In his pool. Again. This time in a sleek black swimsuit, swimming slow, deliberate laps like she belonged there. Samuel didn't speak right away. He stood by the sliding glass door, watching her movements cut across the water. She saw him, of course, but kept swimming as if his presence was irrelevant. When she finally reached the shallow end, she climbed out with calculated grace and wrapped herself in a monogrammed towel. Your gate was open again, she said, not looking at him. I thought you wouldn't mind. It's been so hot today. This time, there was no attempt at diplomacy. Karen, if you step foot in this yard again without my permission, I will call the police, he said firmly. She turned, that infuriating smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Oh, come on, Sam. You're not going to start playing victim, are you? I thought you were tougher than that. The way she said his name, Sam, dripped with condescension as though she were trying to strip away his dignity syllable by syllable. She left slowly, as always, moving like she had all the time in the world. But this time Samuel followed her to the gate and locked it tight behind her. Then he went inside and reviewed the footage from the backyard cameras, every step she took, every word she said, every stroke through the water. It was all there. And something inside him clicked. She wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. She was daring him to retaliate. And he was finally ready to respond. The morning after the second invasion, Samuel found something taped to his mailbox, a folded piece of paper, handwritten again, but the message was shorter this time: be careful who you try to intimidate. Some of us have more friends than you think. There was no signature, but he didn't need one. The handwriting was Karen's, unmistakably elegant, with the same condescending curve to every letter. She was escalating, and now she wasn't hiding it. He reported the trespassing to the local police department, filing everything by the book. He presented the video footage, the messages, even a copy of the HOA rules that clearly outlined property boundaries. The young officer who took the statement nodded along, polite but detached. We'll look into it, he said. But Samuel had heard that tone before. Years of experience taught him the difference between acknowledgement and action. He wasn't naive enough to expect a patrol car on her driveway by sundown. Later that day, he noticed Karen speaking to Richard Evans, the HOA president, near the community park. Their posture was casual, but when Richard looked over at Samuel's house, his expression shifted, something in his eyes tightened. Samuel knew what was happening. Karen wasn't just threatening him in private. She was working her social network, stitching doubt into the community, shaping the narrative so that when the real conflict broke out, she'd already cast herself as the victim. Samuel stood in his living room as the evening light faded, hands folded behind his back, watching his front yard through the window. He wasn't angry. Not yet. What he felt was deeper, a sharp, quiet readiness, the kind of tension that came before a storm. He'd lived his life playing by the rules. But Karen was forcing him to remember the parts of himself he tried to bury. The investigator. The strategist. The man who'd once dismantled drug operations by following shadows. And now there was a new case, one that started with a pool but would end with something far bigger. Samuel hadn't spoken to Marcus Levine in over a decade, not since they walked away from the precinct on the same bitter afternoon. Marcus had been his partner for 5 years, his brother in arms during shootouts, stakeouts, and late-night paperwork. But when internal affairs swept through their department like a firestorm, accusing half the squad of corruption, only one of them made it out with their reputation intact. It wasn't Marcus. Yet on that particular night, with Karen's threats weighing on his chest like sandbags, Samuel found himself scrolling through old contacts until he saw Marcus's name. He hesitated. Memories were heavy things, but pressed call anyway. The voice on the other end was older, slower, but unmistakably Marcus. Well, damn, Sammy D, thought you forgot about me. The warmth in his voice was real. It reminded Samuel of who he used to be before betrayal, before fences, before HOA notices. They met the next day at a quiet diner off Route 54. Over black coffee and dry toast, Samuel laid out everything: the invasions, the notes, the HOA's silence, the neighbors' shifting gazes. Marcus listened without interruption. When Samuel mentioned Karen Montclair's full name, Marcus blinked. Montclair, he repeated. You sure about that? Samuel nodded. Marcus leaned back in his seat, rubbing his jaw. Sam, I think you're sitting next to a ghost you helped create. What Marcus revealed next twisted the entire picture. Karen wasn't just some petty suburban queen. Her brother, Aaron Montclair, had once been involved in a major corruption case within the department, one that Samuel had unknowingly contributed to exposing during a narcotics raid 12 years ago. Aaron went down. Quietly. But not without enemies. Karen, it seemed, had been watching from the sidelines ever since, waiting for her chance to settle the score. And she'd found Samuel's pool before he ever realized he was swimming in her trap. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, surrounded by old case files and fresh memories, his mind racing through every detail Marcus had revealed. Karen Montclair wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was a calculated threat. This wasn't about a pool. This was about revenge. About something that had festered in silence for over a decade. And now Samuel knew, if she had come this far to unsettle him, she wouldn't stop until she broke him or was exposed. By sunrise, he had a plan. Samuel went to the electronics store and returned with 3 more outdoor security cameras, motion sensors, and a backup hard drive. He installed them with methodical precision, covering every blind spot around the pool, side yard, and front gate. He didn't just want footage, he wanted evidence. Footage that couldn't be twisted or denied. He wasn't building walls of defense anymore. He was building a case. He also upgraded his internal security system and moved all his documentation, video clips, complaint letters, HOA correspondence into a digital archive synced with cloud storage and a USB drive locked in a safe. If something were to happen, if the worst came to pass, someone would find the truth preserved. His instincts had kicked back in, not the peaceful man who tended roses and painted his deck, but the seasoned officer who'd once dismantled entire criminal networks with patience and proof. 2 nights later, it paid off. The motion sensor pinged at 2:13 a.m. Samuel, already half awake, watched from his phone as Karen slipped through the side gate with a flashlight in one hand and what looked like a spray bottle in the other. She crouched by the pool, pouring something along the edges, then disappeared into the shadows. It wasn't just trespassing anymore, it was sabotage. And now he had her. Caught in the act. The camera didn't blink, didn't lie. Samuel exhaled slowly. The war had gone silent, but now it had evidence. The next morning, the pool smelled strange, sharp, metallic, with a hint of something synthetic. Samuel didn't need a lab to know that something had been tampered with. He closed the gate and took samples of the water, carefully sealing them in small containers. Whatever Karen had poured, it wasn't just some petty prank. It was calculated. Quiet. Dangerous. That kind of act wasn't random, it was intended to provoke, to destabilize him. But Samuel had been under fire before. He knew how to move under pressure without losing his center. He didn't report the incident yet. He understood timing. Filing a complaint too early would only give her time to twist the story. He needed more than just one video. He needed a pattern. A trail. And that meant waiting, watching, collecting until she trapped herself in her own web. He adjusted the sensitivity on the motion detectors and set up a dummy email account where the footage would auto-upload every 12 hours. No matter what happened next, the truth would not be erased. Still, something shifted in the neighborhood. A few of the other residents, once cordial, now offered only stiff nods or crossed to the other side of the street. Samuel noticed. Karen was winning the war of whispers. She'd begun painting him as the aggressor, moody, paranoid, maybe even dangerous. He could feel it in the air, that cold suspicion, the kind that doesn't speak, just breathes. The quiet rejection of someone who doesn't fit the vibe. But Samuel wasn't afraid of being a target. He had been one before, in alleys, on assignments, in courtrooms. What made this different was the deceit hiding under manicured lawns and polite HOA emails. They weren't calling him names, they were calling lawyers. They weren't throwing punches, they were planting doubts. And as the days passed, he realized something chilling. It wasn't just Karen testing his limits. The whole community, knowingly or not, had joined the silence. And silence, he knew, was the oldest weapon of them all. A week after catching Karen on camera tampering with his pool, Samuel received a formal envelope from the HOA. Unlike the earlier passive-aggressive notices, this one was typed, stamped, and delivered by hand. Inside was a written complaint filed anonymously, claiming that Samuel was creating a hostile environment and harassing neighboring residents. It also accused him of spying on the community with unauthorized cameras, conveniently ignoring the fact that they were on his property. The accusation stung not because it surprised him, but because it was so neatly fabricated. Karen had flipped the narrative. He wasn't the victim anymore, he was the threat. The cameras he'd installed for safety had become surveillance. His self-defense was now labeled aggression. It was an old tactic, one he'd seen before on the force, turn the story upside down before the truth can find its footing. And here, in this peaceful facade of suburbia, the tactic worked just as well. Samuel didn't panic. He responded with a detailed letter of his own, attaching timestamps, screenshots, and an offer to show full video logs. But he knew better than to expect the HOA to act fairly. Richard Evans, the president, scheduled a mediation session between Samuel and Karen. A room. A table. 2 chairs. No lawyers. No cameras. Samuel could already see the setup, neutral tones, fake smiles, and the subtle pressure to let it go for the good of the neighborhood. He declined the meeting. Instead, he submitted a formal police report attaching the video from the night Karen trespassed and tampered with the pool. He also contacted a civil rights attorney, someone recommended by Marcus. He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't bang on doors. He would move methodically with the quiet precision that had kept him alive through the worst days of his life. They wanted to make him the problem. Now he would show them what it looked like when the problem brought proof. The escalation came fast and without warning. 2 days after Samuel filed his police report, a patrol car pulled into his driveway at 7:30 in the morning. The officer, a young white man barely out of academy, knocked on the door with forced politeness. "Mr. Duarte? We received a complaint alleging harassment and intimidation. We're here to ask a few questions." Samuel stood in his doorway composed, but something deep in his chest coiled tight. This wasn't just a visit. This was strategy. Karen had made her move. The allegations were absurd. According to the report, Samuel had confronted a neighbor aggressively, made threatening gestures, and monitored the block with hostile intent. There were no specifics, no names, just enough insinuation to stir fear. Samuel invited the officers in, showed them the camera setup, the footage, and a copy of the letter Karen had taped to his mailbox. He explained calmly, methodically. They nodded, took notes, and left without incident. But the damage wasn't in the arrest, it was in the implication. Later that day, the gossip machine kicked in. He noticed fewer greetings, more curtains twitching when he passed. A mother pulled her child closer when he walked by the park. One neighbor who once asked for lawn care tips now looked away when they crossed paths. The story was spreading, twisted, weaponized, and believable enough for those who already needed a reason to doubt him. Karen hadn't just painted him as angry, she'd made him dangerous. Samuel sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Jasper barked in the distance, Karen's laugh trailing faintly after. She was winning the court of perception, and in places like this, that was often all it took. But what she didn't know, couldn't see, was that Samuel had already begun to shift his strategy. The cameras were still rolling. The evidence was still stacking. And while she waged a war of whispers, he was building something far stronger, a reckoning. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything nearly fell apart. Samuel was out front trimming the hedges, enjoying a rare moment of quiet when 2 squad cars pulled up. Their arrival was swift and deliberate, no sirens, but unmistakably official. A female officer stepped out first, followed by a second in tactical vest. No nods this time. No clipboard questions. Just hands near their belts and eyes already suspicious. Mr. Duarte, the lead officer said, "We need to speak with you. Please step away from the tools." Samuel's hands rose slowly, instinct kicking in before thought. "I'm on my property," he said firmly. "What's this about?" The officer exchanged a glance with her partner. "We received a 911 call. The caller stated you were threatening a neighbor with gardening shears. She said you were pacing and muttering aggressively, potential signs of a breakdown." Samuel stood in disbelief. Gardening shears? A breakdown? It was so absurd, so fabricated, that for a second he almost laughed. But nothing about the tension in the air said funny. He calmly walked to the porch, away from the tools, and asked if he was being detained. They didn't answer immediately. The officer began asking questions about his mental health, his background in law enforcement, if he had any history of anger issues. Samuel understood exactly what was happening. Karen hadn't just lied, she had carefully crafted a scenario that would play into every fear the system had about black men with authority. This wasn't about the shears. It was about setting a trap and hoping the law would spring it. Before things could spiral further, Samuel asked them to wait. He retrieved his phone, pulled up the security footage, once again, a clear time-stamped video showing he'd been quietly trimming hedges for the past hour, never leaving his yard, never raising his voice. The officers reviewed it in silence. Their posture shifted. One of them cleared her throat. "We'll follow up with the caller," she muttered, already turning away. No apology. No retraction. Just silence, and Samuel left standing on his porch, heart racing, knowing how close he'd come to becoming just another headline. That night, Samuel sat alone in his study, the weight of the day's events pressing hard on his chest. Nearly arrested for trimming hedges because a neighbor knew exactly which buttons to push and how the system would respond. He'd spent 3 decades wearing a badge, upholding the law, de-escalating tensions just like the one that had nearly ended his life hours earlier. But now he understood what so many men who looked like him had tried to explain before: the uniform had only ever been a temporary shield. Without it, he was just another suspicious presence. He didn't call Marcus this time, Marcus called him. "I heard," the voice said, low and heavy. "It's already circulating. One of my guys at dispatch sent me the log." Karen called in a code 10 to 96, mental health disturbance. She knew what that meant. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. It was worse than he'd thought. Karen hadn't just wanted him in trouble, she tried to paint him as unstable, dangerous, someone the cops wouldn't hesitate to subdue. That was no longer a neighborhood squabble. That was calculated warfare. But with the call log, the false report, and the video footage, Samuel realized he now had a real legal case. Not just a complaint, not just circumstantial drama, but a sequence of provable events tied to harassment, false reporting, and defamation. He forwarded the call transcript to his attorney, who responded within minutes. "This is it. She crossed the line. Let's make this formal." Samuel agreed. The fight was no longer just about peace. It was about principle. He wouldn't let her rewrite his character on her terms. Still, as he prepared the paperwork, Samuel couldn't help but hear the echoes. The voices of old colleagues, some allies, some enemies ringing in his memory. Warnings about how quickly public favor could turn. Lessons from the force about optics, about restraint, about how power shifts in silence. But he wasn't a rookie anymore. He didn't need their protection. He had the truth, and this time he would walk into the fire with his eyes wide open and the whole world watching. The deeper Samuel dug, the more the picture sharpened, and what it revealed was darker than he had expected. His attorney, Elena Ruiz, had begun a quiet investigation into Karen Montclair's background, starting with public records, archived news clippings, and court documents tied to her brother, Aaron Montclair. What surfaced wasn't just family shame, it was buried scandal. Aaron hadn't just been arrested all those years ago for corruption inside the department. He had walked free after a mysterious plea deal and disappeared from the public eye. But the deal had come at a cost, and Samuel had unknowingly been a part of it. In the early 2010s, Samuel had submitted a report implicating 2 officers tied to a narcotics ring. He had no idea at the time that one of them was Karen's brother. His report, routine and procedural, had triggered a domino effect that sent Aaron into a legal tailspin. The department had protected itself by making Aaron the fall guy, and while Samuel hadn't targeted him personally, his name was all over the files that tore the Montclair family apart. Karen hadn't just stumbled into his life. She had tracked him. The timing of her move into the neighborhood was no coincidence. 6 months after Samuel purchased the house, Karen bought the one down the street, paying in cash. Elena found that strange. Stranger still were her connections to Richard Evans, the HOA president. Emails showed she joined the HOA board quietly within weeks of moving in. Her name didn't appear on the official minutes, but her influence was everywhere. Subtle policy changes. New safety guidelines. Home inspections that conveniently skipped her address. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was embedding herself into a position of power. Samuel sat at his kitchen table, the reports spread before him. It was personal, deeply, dangerously personal. Karen hadn't just come to make his life uncomfortable. She had come to dismantle it step by step under the disguise of rules and regulation. But now she had left a trail. And Samuel, the former investigator who had once cracked cases with nothing but a name and a hunch, was following it straight to the truth. It had haunted him once, Montclair. A name buried deep in his old reports, sealed in boxes he thought he'd never open again. But now hearing it spoken aloud, reading it on HOA letters, watching it scribbled across legal documents, it wasn't just familiar. It was radioactive. Samuel remembered exactly when he'd first written it. A rainy afternoon in 2012, in the back office of Precinct 41, filling out paperwork after a botched narcotics raid. Officer Aaron Montclair had been part of that operation, untrustworthy, arrogant, always working angles. And when things went south, Samuel's report had been the first domino to fall. He hadn't known, at the time, the full extent of Aaron's involvement. Only that the scene didn't add up. Missing evidence. Conflicting timelines. Civilian witnesses who vanished overnight. But he remembered the pressure afterward. The long talks behind closed doors. The veiled warnings from superior officers. One of them even pulled Samuel aside and said, Montclair's family, they don't let things go. Samuel, younger and more idealistic then, had ignored it. He wrote the truth and let the chips fall. Aaron had vanished not long after that plea deal, sealed records, no trial. Samuel moved on. Or so he thought. But now, sitting in his own house under siege by Karen, he realized the past had circled back with unnerving precision. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a vendetta forged in the fallout of a justice system too broken to clean up its own rot. And now, the sister of the man he helped bring down was orchestrating his psychological undoing, using community rules instead of handcuffs. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the surveillance monitor glowing quietly in the corner. He whispered the name aloud, Montclair, as if tasting it again after all these years. Not with fear, but with clarity. The past was no longer a shadow. It was standing in his backyard, smiling through his fence, waving to the neighbors. And this time, Samuel wasn't filing reports for someone else. He was writing the final one himself, with names, dates, and every detail they tried to bury. Aaron Montclair had once been the golden boy of the force, charismatic, sharp, always dressed too clean for a man doing street work. He knew how to work the system, charm his superiors, and twist favors into leverage. But Samuel had seen through the act. Behind Aaron's polished smile was a man who cut corners and traded loyalty for power. He wasn't just dirty, he was dangerous, the kind of officer who made honest cops uneasy. And when the raid at 77 Winslow Street went bad, Aaron's fingerprints were all over it, except, officially, they never were. Samuel remembered that raid vividly. A routine bus turned sideways when the drugs disappeared before they hit the evidence locker. One of the suspects ended up dead in a holding cell under uncertain circumstances. Samuel had filed the report no one else would, pointing out the discrepancies. He hadn't named Aaron directly, but his words led internal affairs straight to him. 2 weeks later, Aaron was gone. Disgraced. Quietly removed. The department never thanked Samuel. In fact, they closed ranks around the fallout, and Samuel learned to live with a target on his back even then. Now, Karen had brought that ghost back into his life. But the difference was Aaron wasn't completely gone. Elena found records indicating that he'd resurfaced under a new business identity, running a private consulting firm specializing in security and corporate investigations. The address traced back to a warehouse in a neighboring county. Elena warned Samuel, he's still active. Still dangerous. And Karen may not be acting alone. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a coordinated effort. The realization settled like lead in Samuel's stomach. The pool invasions, the false 911 calls, the HOA manipulation, it had all been designed to make him react, to break his calm, to force a mistake they could exploit legally. Karen wasn't just the face of the plan. She was the bait. And somewhere in the background, her brother was pulling strings again. The Montclairs had returned not for justice, but for destruction. And now Samuel had to make a choice, wait for the trap to snap shut or spring it himself on his terms. Samuel had always believed in facing threats head-on. But this time, the enemy wasn't in uniform or on the street. It was concealed behind manicured lawns, HOA policies, and weaponized civility. Karen played the visible role, stirring the pot with a smile, but Samuel now saw the outline of someone operating just beyond her reach. The timing of everything, the precision, it was too clean. This was Aaron's style. Subtle, systemic, and always designed to leave the target isolated before making a move. The warehouse listed as Aaron's business address was cold and empty when Elena's contact checked it out. No signage, no active staff. Just one security camera and a back office with records too recently shredded to be coincidental. But it was enough to confirm the connection. Aaron Montclair wasn't just quietly watching, he was involved. Possibly funding Karen's legal counsel. Maybe feeding her tactics. It didn't matter how far removed he appeared. The fingerprints were there. Hidden, yes, but unmistakable to someone who knew how to read shadows. Samuel spent the following days tightening every weak point. He met with Elena in person, handed her backups of the surveillance footage, and reviewed every legal option at their disposal. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was preparing for a counteroffensive. Elena contacted an investigative journalist she trusted, someone hungry for a story, especially one involving corruption, power abuse, and racial manipulation inside gated communities. Samuel gave the green light. If the system wouldn't listen quietly, maybe the public would listen loudly. Still, he moved with caution. Karen hadn't made another appearance since the 911 call, but he saw her car pass by daily, slowly, always watching. She had pulled back, waiting. Maybe regrouping. Maybe escalating. The neighborhood grew quieter around him, the kind of quiet that no longer felt peaceful. And deep in his gut, Samuel sensed it, the next strike wouldn't be passive. It would be surgical. Public. And just like years ago in that precinct hallway, he knew the real battle wasn't about what people saw, it was about what they were willing to believe. For the first time since Karen stepped foot in his yard, doubt crept into Samuel's mind, not about the facts, but about the outcome. He had done everything right, documented, reported, protected himself. But he'd also seen how truth could be buried beneath perception. He'd seen it in courtrooms, in precinct halls, and on the street corners of Atlanta, how easily a man could become invisible if enough people decided he was inconvenient. And now, in the suburban maze of smiles and silence, he feared he was disappearing all over again. Late at night, Samuel walked through his house in the dark, barefoot, the silence too thick to ignore. Each room echoed with memory, his old badge tucked in a drawer, newspaper clippings from commendations long forgotten, his father's folded flag sitting above the mantel. He had built this home as a sanctuary, but now it felt like a bunker. A place under siege. Sometimes, in the quiet, he'd hear voices that weren't there, radio static, the sound of boots on tile. Ghosts of a life he had left behind. But they didn't come to haunt him. They came to warn him, stay sharp. Stay standing. He watched the neighbors more closely now. The ones who once waved now avoided eye contact. A few whispered just out of earshot. One even crossed the street as Samuel approached with his recycling bin. It wasn't fear, they didn't think he was dangerous. It was discomfort. He had become the crack in their illusion of peace. A reminder that justice wasn't always quiet and that truth sometimes wore a darker face than their community was willing to accept. But despite the isolation, despite the ghosts, Samuel felt something else rising inside him, resolve. He hadn't survived decades in the force to be undone by a woman with a grudge and a man too cowardly to face him directly. They wanted to wear him down, confuse him, isolate him into silence. But they had forgotten one crucial thing, he was still here. And every time they pushed him further into doubt, they only sharpened his focus. The storm was coming. But this time Samuel wasn't just waiting for it. He was walking toward it. The knock on Samuel's door came just past noon, 3 gentle raps, hesitant, like someone wasn't sure they belonged there. When he opened it, he found a young man in his late 20s standing nervously on the porch, clutching a folder to his chest. He had a press badge clipped to his belt and eyes that moved like they were always scanning, measuring. "Mr. Duarte?" the man asked. "My name's Miles Green. I'm with the Ledger. I think I can help tell your story." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You with the media?" Miles nodded. "Not the kind that edits you into a villain. The kind that still believes in putting the whole truth on paper even if it makes people uncomfortable." He held up the folder. "Elena Ruiz sent me. She said you might be ready to let the public in before the HOA buries you quietly." There was no arrogance in his voice. Just honesty. And maybe a touch of fire, the same kind Samuel used to carry in his younger years before life taught him how fast that fire could be smothered. They sat by the pool, the same pool that had become the epicenter of everything. Miles listened, recording the interview on a discreet mic, his notes flying as Samuel spoke, not just about Karen and Aaron, but the long history that led here. The false complaints. The fabricated mental health call. The cameras. The silence of the neighborhood. And the legacy of being both a protector and a suspect in the same breath. Miles didn't interrupt. He didn't dramatize. He documented. And Samuel saw something rare in his expression: respect. As the interview wrapped, Miles leaned forward. They've done this before, Mr. Duarte. Not just to you. To veterans. To immigrants. To anyone who threatens the order. But the difference is you have evidence. And a voice that people will listen to because you've been on both sides of the badge. Samuel gave a small nod, something heavy lifting from his shoulders. Maybe this was the shift he needed. Not a courtroom. Not a boardroom. But a story raw, unfiltered, undeniable, told loud enough to drown out the whispers. What Samuel hadn't realized at first was that Miles wasn't just a reporter, he was also a neighbor. 3 houses over, in a modest one-story with ivy creeping up the brick. He had moved in only a year ago, quiet and unnoticed, much like Samuel himself had hoped to be. But now, with his recorder off and his pen down, Miles offered something more than journalism. He offered proximity, insight, and most important of all, witness. I've seen her, Miles said as they walked the block that evening. Karen. Watching. Lurking. Always pretending it's just coincidence when she turns up outside your gate. He explained how on more than one occasion he'd watched her talk to Richard Evans, the HOA president, always with a whisper, always ending with a glance in Samuel's direction. I didn't know the full story until now. But I knew something was off. And I kept notes. Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: validation. Not from a court. Not from the police. But from a peer. Someone who had nothing to gain by siding with him and everything to lose by speaking out in a community that was quickly circling its wagons. Miles offered him his journal, handwritten entries with timestamps, casual observations that, when stacked together, painted a very clear picture of ongoing harassment and social engineering. It was small, yes, but powerful. They sat on Samuel's porch that night as the sky turned purple and the streetlights flickered on. For the first time, Samuel didn't feel entirely alone. You're not just telling a story, he said to Miles. You're becoming part of it. Miles nodded. I know. But some stories need that. Especially the ones no one wants to believe. As they spoke, Karen's porch light clicked on across the street. She stood in her doorway watching them, expression unreadable. But this time Samuel didn't look away. The next morning, Elena called with urgency in her voice. We got something, she said. And it's not just useful, it's explosive. A former officer from Internal Affairs, now retired and no longer bound by silence, had agreed to speak. He had reviewed Samuel's case from over a decade ago, the Aaron Montclair file, and confirmed what Samuel had always suspected: the department had made Aaron the fall guy, but not to clean house. They did it to protect higher-ranking officers tied to an even deeper corruption ring. Aaron was guilty, yes, but he was also a shield. A distraction. What Elena had now was more than a testimony. She had a leak. The XIA officer had provided her with digital copies of sealed files, pages redacted for the public but preserved in full internally. The documents detailed suppressed investigations, backroom deals, and a list of officers tied to the narcotics evidence scandal. Samuel's name was there too, not as a suspect, but as the one who unknowingly initiated the internal audit. His report had triggered a chain reaction. It was his integrity that had upended everything. And Karen. Karen had never let that go. Among the files were photographs, old crime scene shots, mugshots, surveillance images. And one stood out, a photo of Karen, younger, sitting beside Aaron at a disciplinary hearing. She wasn't just the sister. She had been in the room. She'd watched it all fall apart. No wonder her attacks had been so precise. This wasn't just about vengeance. It was about humiliation. She wasn't trying to defeat Samuel. She was trying to erase the man who reminded her of her family's disgrace. Samuel stared at the files, feeling both vindicated and enraged. He had carried the burden of that case like a scar, thinking it was long behind him. But now the truth was rising, and with it an opportunity. With Elena's legal expertise, Miles's journalistic reach, and this evidence, he didn't just have a case. He had a weapon. One forged in shame, secrecy, and the one thing the Montclairs never expected him to still possess: the truth. The article dropped on a Monday morning. Miles Green didn't just write a story, he delivered a bombshell. A war in the suburbs, how a retired black officer became the target of silent retaliation, lit up the homepage of the Ledger before 8 a.m., complete with excerpts from Samuel's surveillance footage, scanned HOA complaints, The false police report transcripts and, most damning of all, the leaked internal files linking Karen Montclair and her disgraced brother to a department-wide cover-up. Within hours, Samuel's phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, activists, a national morning show. Even a congresswoman's office called requesting a statement. It was more attention than he ever wanted, but for the first time, the narrative was no longer being whispered behind his back. It was being shouted across the country. And in this version of the story, Samuel wasn't the aggressor. He was the survivor. The whistleblower. The man who had stood his ground while the system tried to erase him again. Karen's house went dark that day. Her porch light stayed off. No Jasper barking at the fence. No smug walks past his yard. And when the HOA tried to distance themselves with a bland, internal review statement, Miles published a follow-up piece detailing their passive complicity. Richard Evans resigned 2 days later. Anonymous neighbors began slipping Samuel apology letters. Someone left flowers at his gate. The same people who once avoided his eyes now couldn't look away from the truth. But Samuel remained calm. Steady. He wasn't interested in fame or revenge. He wanted peace, but peace on his terms. And now finally he had leverage. The spotlight wouldn't last forever, he knew that. But while it was here, he would use it not just to defend himself, but to expose how easily power hides behind smiles and fences. The past had finally caught up to him, but so had justice. And in the space between them, Samuel stood tall, a man who never needed to shout because the truth now spoke louder than anything else. The courthouse steps were swarming with cameras, microphones, and murmurs when Samuel arrived. He didn't wear a suit to impress. He wore the same clean-cut shirt and blazer he used the day he retired from the force, symbolic, silent, dignified. Elena walked beside him, calm and composed, carrying the legal briefs that now held the weight of an entire neighborhood's buried sins. It wasn't just a harassment suit anymore. It had evolved into a civil case for defamation, emotional distress, and racial targeting, with mounting pressure to investigate the HOA for misconduct. Karen didn't speak to the press that day. She was ushered into a side entrance by her attorney, face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, head lowered. The woman who once paraded around his yard with entitlement now moved like someone being hunted by the very system she thought would protect her. Inside the courtroom, her composure cracked. When the judge reviewed the video footage of her trespassing, the chemical sabotage, the 2 a.m. intrusion, she winced. When the 911 recording played and her lie about Samuel's breakdown echoed through the speakers, her attorney shifted uncomfortably. But it was when the IA files were introduced that the atmosphere changed entirely. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The Montclair name, the sealed corruption cases, the family connection, it all unraveled under oath. Karen's defense team tried to object, tried to frame it as irrelevant, but the judge disagreed. Motive is the backbone of harassment, she said firmly. And in that moment, Karen wasn't just a disgruntled neighbor. She was a woman carrying out a calculated act of vengeance on a man who had once stood for integrity when no one else did. Outside, as reporters swarmed again, Samuel made only one statement. I didn't ask for a fight. I asked for peace. But when someone tries to erase your voice, your history, and your dignity, sometimes the only response is to make sure they can't ignore you anymore. The world heard him. Loud and clear. It began quietly, as most falls from grace do. First, Karen Montclair was voted out of the HOA board in an emergency session, unanimously. No one came to her defense. Not even the neighbors who once leaned on her for social dominance and subtle gatekeeping. Her influence, once absolute within the neighborhood, dissolved almost overnight. Yard signs supporting her recall appeared like mushrooms after rain. And the looks she used to give others, those sharp, condescending stares, now followed her at every corner, only this time she was the one shrinking beneath them. Local news picked up the story. Headlines called her the suburban saboteur. National talk shows debated the implications of HOA abuse and racially motivated weaponization of community power. Her name, once wielded like currency in social circles, became synonymous with shame. Even her job, an executive position at a private real estate firm, released a statement distancing themselves from her behavior. Within days, she was placed on indefinite leave. Her LinkedIn profile vanished. But the worst part wasn't public, it was personal. Karen could no longer walk her dog without whispered judgment following behind. Friends stopped answering calls. Her home, once a symbol of suburban prestige, became a fortress of avoidance. She reportedly received anonymous letters, not threatening but condemning. Handwritten notes from strangers who once believed her stories now apologized for ever giving her the benefit of the doubt. She had overplayed her hand and the entire community had seen the cards. Samuel watched it all unfold from the quiet of his porch. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply existed openly, freely, without fear. That, more than any courtroom ruling or headline, was the true justice. Karen had tried to erase him. Instead, she erased herself. And in the void her absence left behind, a new atmosphere settled over the neighborhood: awareness, caution, and, for the first time since he'd moved in, respect. For the first time in years, Samuel Duarte was no longer just a man in the background. He was in the papers, on the airwaves, and perhaps most unexpectedly, he was trending. Interviews requests came in from national outlets. His story resonated not just with retired officers but with veterans, community leaders, and everyday people who had felt silenced or targeted by invisible systems. He wasn't famous in the way celebrities are. He was respected, and that, to Samuel, meant everything. He chose his media appearances carefully. When he sat down with 60 Minutes, he wore his old dress badge and spoke not with rage, but with resolve. "This wasn't just about me," he told the host. "This was about a system that lets quiet power manipulate truth. And if it can happen in a quiet cul-de-sac with a white picket fence, then it can happen anywhere." That segment alone reached millions. Letters poured in. Some from survivors of HOA harassment. Others from young officers struggling to keep their integrity. A few simply said, "Thank you for standing up." But the spotlight came with complications too. There were critics, people who claimed he exaggerated, who believed Karen's version of the story even now. There were online trolls, ugly comments, threats veiled as concerned observations. But Samuel had been under worse pressure in uniform. He'd walked through gunfire. These were words on a screen. And unlike before, he wasn't fighting alone. Elena's legal team stayed on alert, and Miles kept publishing updates that shut down false narratives before they could take root. What surprised Samuel most, however, was the local response. Kids waved at him when he walked past. A local middle school invited him to speak. An old widow brought him a pie with a card that said, "I never said anything, but I always knew you didn't deserve what they did." In every corner of the neighborhood that once recoiled from him, there was now acknowledgement. He hadn't just reclaimed his peace. He had redefined it on his terms, in full view of those who once looked away. The water was still, calm, reflective, just as it had been the first morning Samuel moved into the house, before the trespassing, the whispers, the false complaints. But now, as he stood at the edge of the pool, everything had changed. The place that had once become a battlefield was once again a sanctuary, not just because the attacks had ended, but because Samuel had faced them and endured. The pool hadn't just survived the storm. It had become a symbol of it. He leaned down and ran his fingers through the water. The sun glinted off the surface like glass. No chemicals laced it now. No footprints where they shouldn't be. The cameras still watched silently from their corners, but there was no more need to review footage. The danger had passed. Karen's house remained unsold, its windows dark, a quiet monument to her own downfall. Occasionally, someone would pass by and glance at it, then quickly look away. Shame is heavier when it's shared by a community. That weekend, Samuel invited a few of the neighbors over, not all, just the ones who had apologized, who had spoken up, who had stood beside him when the story broke wide. It wasn't a grand party. Just jazz playing low, lemonade sweating on the table, a few lawn chairs near the pool. They talked, laughed gently, and for the first time, no one looked around to see who was watching. There was no HOA lurking, no false accusations hiding behind smiles. Just people. Human again. As the sun dipped below the tree line and twilight settled over the yard, Samuel sat quietly near the water, watching the reflections ripple. He thought of his father, who never lived to see him retire. He thought of the men he served with, the ones who didn't make it out. He thought of the younger version of himself who once believed justice was something only found in law books. And he smiled, not because the world was fixed, but because, in this small corner of it, he had restored what they tried to steal. Peace. Dignity. Home. The silence was no longer suffocating, it was earned. It was the kind that settled after something has been rebuilt, when the dust is cleared and the air is no longer heavy with tension. Samuel woke each morning not expecting a new fight, but grateful there wasn't one. The quiet wasn't absence, it was presence. The absence of fear. The presence of peace. The neighborhood had changed, if only slightly. The HOA, now under new leadership, rewrote several of its bylaws, adding language about racial bias, homeowners' rights, and transparent complaint procedures. A few board members left. A few stayed and apologized. And while no apology could undo